My name is Sharon Hirsch, and I want to welcome you to this video cast in honor of the release of my new book, Belonging, Finding the Way Back to One Another. In fact, you can buy a copy of the book at a significant discount at the address that is scrolling across the bottom of your screen. Tonight, we are talking all things therapy, and I am with Dr. Jim Coffield, a former well-loved professor from Reformed Theological Seminary, a current pastor of counseling at a church in Tennessee, a clinical supervisor of therapists, and the best storyteller I know. Welcome, Jim.
That's a great introduction, Sherry. Thanks. Most of it's not true, but thank you.
What's not true?
Well, I do want you to know, I did get a chance to read, and you sent me a copy of your book, and I've really enjoyed it, and hope we get a chance to talk a little about that as well as we talk about therapy.
I do too. I thought, in fact, I would start by reading a quotation from my book that I think aptly describes the time that we are living in. Sometimes the story goes like this. The earth may shake. The ship may sink. Families will be torn apart. Viruses will sneak up on us. Countries will war against each other and themselves. Terrible people will be elected as rulers. Floods will swallow the earth. Famines will leave people hungry. And the landmarks of faith, hope, and love will be covered up. God answers, you're going to need me. And you're going to need one another. Well, that paragraph may aptly describe these times of disconnection and disorientation, but I'm not sure that many of us are leaning into one another or even into God. And that makes for some significant content in therapy.
Oh, it really does. I mean, I'm seeing an incredible amount of issues with anxiety. And then the most simple way to think about anxiety is it often has something to do with control. And it just feels like everything is out of control for us.
It is out of control.
The things that matter most to me, I can't control. We can't control what's going to be happening with this virus. We can't control so much. And so you add the idea that healthy people have relationships. Healthy people, an addiction is a step away from relationship. And a step into relationship is a step toward recovery for all of us. And yet we find ourselves isolated and lonely and afraid. And when we're afraid, we tend to pull back and to protect. And it's impossible to love someone else and self-protect.
Self-protection kind of makes sense when you don't know what side somebody's on, or even within your own family, what issues you should bring up and what issues you should stay away from, which makes us a little disconnected in conversations when we're always thinking another narrative besides what's truly going on in our hearts. So as therapists, how do we invite people to tell the true story they're telling themselves?
If I could just say one thing before that's such a good question, but I do think these times are odd times, and we need to pray that these odd times won't be wasted in our lives. But one of the things that happens is because it seems like the conversations in the marketplace are such extreme conversations now. And if I want to belong, I have to pick some side that's more extreme than where I am. And I have to pick some, and I have to begin to, because I don't want to not belong. I mean, so often the people on the far sides are not wanting to know what I think. They want to know that I think the way they do. And if I want to belong, and God put in us, as you describe in your book, just a longing to belong. There's something about that sense of that is in all of us. And so we find ourselves in these odd times when I want to belong, and yet to belong, I've got to sometimes agree with or say things, or because people are wanting to know if I fit what they want, and it's an exhausting time, and it's a time that, if we're not careful, will lead to living artificially, out of a false self, with a lot of image management.
Hmm. And so that image management comes with a cost, because if I'm always wearing a mask, even into therapy, which it's always been curious to me why people would pay to pretend with their therapist, but it's just kind of second nature to some of us. I'm speaking for myself. When I wear a mask, people can only love the mask, and that does not create that sense of belonging. And so I think there needs to be some sense. And of course, people coming into therapy or people in therapy, and sometimes us therapists, don't have a strong sense of belonging to ourselves. Brene Brown talks about braving the wilderness and being willing to kind of walk away from maybe that group think that you're talking about, that's just aligning with a cause or a side. And it is a wilderness for a little while, and you do have to have a sense that you're connected to yourself. How does that happen?
Yeah, there really has to be a sense that, you mentioned in the book the idea of transcendence, the idea that, you know, we are people made in the image of God. And the one thing that the evolutionary psychologists can't explain, or there's a few things that can't explain. One is our love for art and beauty.
Hmm.
But the other thing that they can't explain is that longing to transcend, that longing to be about something bigger, to be a part of something. And that's so, that's why God doesn't need us. That's
Hmm.
why He invites us to be about His business. It's not. I mean, remember, remember when the Pharisees told Jesus that he needed to shut everybody up, and He said, "I could get the rocks to sing my praises." I mean, I don't. The reason God allows you to have a purposeful life uh, in His family is because it is not because He's needs you. Jesus didn't save us. He wants to use us. He saved us because He loves us,
Hmm.
and He invites us to have a purposeful life. And in that, you have a sense of weight about you, of belonging, because it's not just about you um, or your latest just your latest thought or feeling, though those are important to God. Those aren't the things that have to drive all of your life.
I love what you said, that God doesn't need us, but somehow He still wants us. And I don't think that, I know I'm speaking for myself again. I don't get the full impact of that unless I'm willing to tell the truth about my life. And that's why I believe in therapy, because it is sometimes a place where that truth starts to eke out. I mean, one of the things I've learned the hard way that I wrote in the book is that we don't carry our secrets, they carry us.
Yeah, that's really true. And let me just say at the beginning of our time together, Sharon, I'm probably not going to be near as honest as you. Um, I was, I think one of the things I really enjoy about your writing and your teaching is how honest and transparent you are. And I would just say to people when they read, they may go, "Well, I can't go there yet." And I would just say, just take off as much as you can. Be as
And
honest as you can about what is true, even if it's just a small layer at first. What would it mean to really be you in a relationship with another person? What would it mean because that's what the Bible teaches us we're allowed to do with God. That's what uh,
yes,
the laments of Scripture are not whining. It's not an invitation to whine. A whine is when you kind of say, um, what are you doing? And you walk away from relationship. A lament is when you question and walk toward relationship.
oh, I love that.
And
And
oh, go
so
ahead.
the first story I tell in the book is about a DUI that I got many years ago. I have not spoken of that story until the last year because I wasn't ready to it. Because it does have, and still does have, a lot of shame and fear. In fact, the first time I told that story, which always intrigues me, was at the University of Central Florida. to a group of college kids, many of them unbelievers, because quite honestly, that felt safer to me than telling the story to my peers or maybe at church in a group of believers. Of course, I told the story in Alcoholics Anonymous, of which I am a card carrying member of the club. But I think what you said is really true, that we start where we can. And as we lament, tell the truth, confess what we can. And I think that's honoring our story. And then God opens our hearts to a little bit more. And really, that is what belonging is based on, is a heart that's broken open, which seems counterintuitive to most of us who've lived our whole lives trying to cover that up.
It is amazing that it's in the brokenness and in my confusion, I often find faith.
Hmm.
That 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 often I am compelled to love when I find myself at the end of myself and unable to love.
Hmm.
And asking for God to meet me in my inability to love. It is so upside down, so counterintuitive that God works in our brokenness in a way that um, and that's why this is such an important time that we're living in. This is a very broken time for all of us. For
It is.
for people are lonely, people are afraid. Um, there's a pandemic. I'm concerned. My son, who's 31 and autistic, has all sorts of medical problems, and his doctor called us. When this first started, and said, your son can't get this. You've got to be very, very careful. And what that does to a father, what that does to a mother, to think, well, I've got to make sure this doesn't make it to our home. Well, I don't control that completely. I can be careful, I can be wise, but you don't control that, and so that creates a sense of I'm at the end of my ability to fix, to make it work, to kind of keep my image up, and then you find yourself at a place where you say, what would it look like to stumble toward trust in these times? What would it look like to stumble toward authenticity and vulnerability? Because uh, out of that can grow intimacy. Out of that can grow life.
I think people were struck. I know you can't see the questions, but I can. And a few people, including Josiah, was struck by your comment that lament, which of course includes the things you just talked about, fear, what I talked about, shame, um, that is moving toward relationship. I think we barely know how to do that. And that's why we don't have a sense of belonging even to God. I
Yeah,
mean, so many people tell me, well, you're not supposed to talk to God like that. And so, this concept of lament and grieving this trauma that we are all in right now, whether we admit it or not, seems really important.
yeah. Well, the sorrow. What you find when you take your sorrow to the Lord, your doubts to Him, your fears to Him, that vulnerability creates connection with Him. This is a third of the Psalms, as you know, are laments, and they and often they switch in the middle to praise. And how does lament change to praise? Well, it changes because when I'm vulnerable before God, and I move toward Him in that pain, and He hears me, there's something that changes in me. All of a sudden, it's not just about me and my pain, but I'm now connected to Him. And that's that. It's kind of the long last. That's So that's a great word. The long lost art of lament, and that I think God would love for us to kind of reintroduce to the American church. I'm sure it was someone much smarter than me that said we probably don't need a theology of prosperity. We need a theology of suffering and sorrow. Um,
And so
because
talking to God about it is one thing. I love what my pastor says, that when you complain about God to other people, that's gossip. But when you complain about God to God, that's worship. We can maybe barely believe that. But then to take that to other people, because we as human beings were made for that face to face, soul to soul connection. I think David asked a good question. He said, for most people, grief and trauma triggers isolation and addiction, not necessarily this beautiful communion that you just described that we can have with God.
well, it's because we're looking for relief and we're looking for escape. Um, and when but the reason that if you do lament, you'll find that the things that you numb yourself with are not very satisfying. You'll find that the things that you go to just numb you from real life are very dissatisfying.
They are. I mean, I can speak from experience again here that there's not enough of anything to satisfy us. And now that we're home with binge watching television, and we've all watched everything on Netflix, and we've seen the purchase of alcohol skyrocket by 70% during this pandemic. I mean, the state of Colorado freaked out when our governor said he was going to close the liquor stores. The lines were so long, he changed his mind in 2 hours. Because we just can't conceive as human beings that relief, the consolation that we seek, actually comes in human connection. Because most of us have been burned.
Yeah, we have. We are made for connection, um, and ultimately, sin, if you will, is it separates us. It separates us ultimately from God, but from each other, from ourselves, from creation. It's a separator, and that's why all of God's stories, God is writing the story when at the end it's a connecting story. It's a gracious connecting story. You know that the evil one is writing the story when at the end everyone is separated and isolated.
Wow.
Um, because God writes stories. The arc of the history of the world, the arc of the Bible is toward redemption, and redemption is that reconnecting of man with God, and that's that's the arc of history, and so when God writes His story, the Book of Revelations ends in glorification and beauty, and everyone together worshiping Him, and creation brought back unto Himself. That's um, that's how the story ends. And so when God is writing a story, a smaller story, um, and when God is writing your story, his he's got an eye toward redemption. He's got an eye toward connection. He's got an eye toward belonging. That's why so often Jesus, when he talked about unity, and that people, by this they'll know your mind for the love you have for each other. That people who know Him will live in such a way, and how we have not done this, would live in such a way that we would be connected to each other, care about each other, be more united with one another.
So it brings a story to mind. As therapists, we talk with people who sometimes are in those fearful, shameful places where they have been judged or they would be judged or considered suspect by part of the respectable. I think of a teenager who came to see me who declared that he was joining the Wiccan religion, which of course freaked his parents out, and they sent him to me for therapy. And so I hastily did some research on the Wiccan religion and found out that it really isn't about faith at all. It's about control, like you were talking about earlier. The principle, very simplified, I'm sure, is that the better you are at doing the spells, the more likely they are to come true. So I knew he couldn't talk about this at his Christian school. His parents were appalled. And I wanted my office to be a brave space where we could talk about anything. And one day I asked him, I said, so do you really want to be in control that much? Because it just sounds exhausting to me. And he said, no, I really don't. And I kind of understood the slump of his shoulders because I've experienced that exhausting effort of trying to hold that beach ball under the water 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, feeling like you've got things under control. And so then I asked him, well, would you like to believe that someone is in control? And wisely, he said, that's the trick, though. That means I would have to trust someone other than myself. And so I told him, hey, I don't mind earning your trust. So for weeks, we talked about faith and doubt and God and Wiccan and the things that he didn't want in his parents' religion or his friends' religion. And he came in one day. I don't know how he made this leap because I'm not the one writing his story. But he said, okay, I've decided to trust God, but I want a tattoo. And I really did not have a hard time convincing his parents because they were just so relieved that he didn't want to be Wiccan anymore. So his parents and I and him went to a tattoo parlor where he got a cross wearing his faith on his sleeve, so to speak, tattooed onto his leg to demonstrate his commitment to the Christian faith. And I thought about that little group of belonging that started with not being afraid of the truth, knowing that there is, as you said, a deeper story, that he was gravitating toward a small story where he had to be the one in control instead of gravitating toward that one that you, as you mentioned, doesn't need us, but oh, how he wants us. And that to me is the privilege of therapy. Yes, we hear, especially in these days. I mean, you told me before we began that you've seen suicidal ideation, depression, I've seen agitation, marriages falling apart, addiction, rampant. If we can stay in the small story, lamenting that this is not who we were made to be. You feel like that's the way toward the
Oh,
deep?
yeah. I think it's also helpful, and you mentioned in your book the idea of appetite, but it's also helpful to remember that evil is not creative.
Hmm.
All evil can do is sabotage good. Um, Addiction is a hijacking of the reward system in your brain. The you know and so what happens is that evil only exists as a perversion of good, and that's why it's helpful sometimes instead of to quickly deal with the surface of something with someone, but to listen long enough to what's so that they can see what's underneath the surface of that. It's what's underneath the kid's poor choice of when he was thinking about Wiccan was um, was a longing for something that had control. Longing for ultimately it was a longing for Christ. Though
Yeah.
he didn't label it as such. He didn't see it as such. And if you just had stayed at the top um, and missed the beauty of what's underneath his fear and his question, what has been hijacked by the evil one, um, then you would have missed you would have missed that. And so anyway, all that to just be reminded that that underneath, it was C.S. Lewis who said it so well, that it's not that we want too much, we settle for too little. An often quoted comment of his. But there is a reality that that we have we kind of sell ourselves something so much cheaper than what God has invited us to.
So I love what you said. If we listen long enough, we'll hear those longings for the deeper story, which is to be known, to be loved unconditionally, to be wanted even when we've messed up. But as a therapist who's been doing this a little while, I mean, probably between the two of us, we've been doing it 40, 50 years. Do families ever get mad at you because they want the problem fixed?
Yeah.
Especially when someone is choosing a different lifestyle, making bad choices in a destructive relationship with an addiction, um, considering a divorce. I think the church and families often would like to see that tidied up pretty quickly. And that's not how therapy works, is it?
Well, I had someone, a gentleman, not that long ago, come in who had a secret that he'd been holding. He was in his late 70s. A secret that he'd held since he was a teenager that was a source of great shame, and and it has owned him for most of his life.
Wow.
And I told him, I said, you got two choices. Your strategy was to bury it, pretend that it didn't matter, and just push it away. The way you said a minute ago, Sharon, you're gonna holding a beach ball under the water, or you can do something that's going to feel very counterintuitive, and that's tell me the story. Um, let's talk about that secret because God already knows about the secret,
Right.
and and you know about it, and so we might as well bring it out in the open so that there can be some healing before you go to heaven. Um, he said, "Well, why isn't I just wanted this just to go away?" And I said, "Well, you've tried to bury it for the better part of 55, 60 years. Um, maybe a different strategies." Um, and so he begins telling me something that he's not told anybody else,
Mm.
which is sacred. That I would be given the
Yes.
privilege of hearing that story. It was it was just so sad that has literally owned him for his life, and here he is going toward the latter part of his life, his last few, and knowing that most of his life he has spent not being present, not really letting anybody see who he really is, but instead living an inauthentic, image-based life full of shame and guilt.
I mean, it does sound like going in and out of disconnection because when we let trauma keep its grip on us, whether it's trauma that's been done to us or trauma that we have put ourselves in the middle of, or the trauma that we're all living in right now, we do kind of feel like I can't bear it. I need some relief, or I can't tell people what I'm really thinking. So we go in and out of connection into disconnection, watch a little TV, have a little bit to drink, eat a couple donuts, work really intently, get a good grade, achieve something, which can all be disconnecting behaviors. And carrying around that bowling ball inside of us that could be released by talking about it.
Yeah, and the idea that God would want us to have a freedom, that the power of the gospel, the that that God would love for us to be a part of His grand story of redemption that would include the redemption of the broken places in our own lives,
Mm.
um, is lost on our pretending and our images, and um, and I find myself still doing that in my life at times. Still, um, almost having to make the decision today. Am I going to find my life in food or in success, whatever that might look like, or am I going to really be present with the people God's put in front of me? Am I really going to be engaged in their lives for the sake of the gospel? Am I going to be? And it really, um, it's really quite fascinating how when you start thinking that way, how often you'll find yourself just checking out.
Yes, I think, I hope this is encouraging to the people who are listening, because you and I are probably older than most of them.
I
And
would guess I'm not speaking for you, Sharon, but
I can speak
but
for
being a dinosaur myself, I am probably older than I mean, just the fact that I've worked the computer tonight may be a
I
miracle of
am
God in
grateful.
and of itself.
Yes. But I think what I hear you saying and what I've experienced is whether in our own lives, this practice of being here now and watching clients connect with their true self so that they can really feel the weight of God's story and hopefully connect with others takes time. Um, and we don't like that in our culture. I mean, most change is not spectacular. It occurs over a lifetime. In my book, I tell the story of getting my 10-year sobriety coin that took me 30 years to get. And because it was often 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And those are the kind of stories that can be discouraging to therapists too, because if we're measuring our worth or our success on outcomes, we're going to get discouraged in our own lives and in the lives of those that we work with and that we love.
Yeah, the idea that because outcome will always be ultimately concerned about performance um, and then you're gonna wrestle with perfection and you just start down a road. There's something that God's inviting us to be a part of, in this kind of in journeying with Him and walking with Him and walking with each other. That um, that is very very powerful in our lives. That it's not just being an observer of life or a connoisseur of other people's lives. And that's so often what we do when we look at media. I'm amazed at how often I look at my phone. I'm amazed at how often my family will be around a table and everyone's got their phone out and I realize we're all sitting here together
Yeah.
looking at phones and images. But yeah, there is a way in which we disconnect because we're afraid.
Well, this whole world has wired us for disconnection. And yet God has woven into the core of our design a wiring for belonging. And He starts it with Him, that we belong to Him through no efforts of our own. Doesn't matter what our best day looked like, what our worst day looked like. It doesn't matter what we look like, because it really is all about Him. Belonging is the anti-narcissism that this world needs desperately right now. And if we believe that, then my hope is that we could start extending similar welcome and a sense of worthiness to other people, no matter where they are in their story, even though
It
that
is
might not be popular with everyone.
it is amazing to me what happens to people when they're offered dignity. Um, I have a special. I have an exceptional young son who's 31 years old. He's forever 7. But one of the many things he has provided for me is he's almost a mirror to the world. And so it'll be interesting to see when I go out with him and how people treat him. And it's amazing. He may not be able to read at 31. He may be forever 7, but he can sniff dignity out like a shark goes for blood. I mean, he knows when he's being treated with a sense of dignity, and he knows when he's being mocked or made fun of or ignored or patronized. And it's amazing. He's given me this curiosity, about the power of dignity offered,
Hmm.
because um, there's something very visceral about that, because that dignity says, I want relationship with you. I want to connect with you.
And so, one question on the feed is why Alcoholics Anonymous or similar groups seem to give dignity um, when evangelical Christians who have the promise of the gospel often seem more focused on depravity and don't create that sense of belonging. I don't know the answer to that question. I know I've experienced it.
It's a great question. I think that there is something about the way that the Alcoholics Anonymous and those sort of groups begin that acknowledge that we're all broken. And sometimes when we go to our churches, instead we don't acknowledge our brokenness. We acknowledge other people's brokenness,
Right.
or we acknowledge that everybody else is broken, the world is broken, this group is broken, but we aren't. And I think in doing that, we kind of create a world where everybody starts pretending, uh, and in our pretending, we don't. No one's vulnerable, and when no one's vulnerable, no one feels connected. And when no one feels connected, very little growth can take place. And so, um, whereas in those meetings, they begin with a sense of, I mean, most of them begin with a call out that without God you can't change, but you are a broken person. And when that's the starting spot, it does create a very fertile soil for someone to say, all right.
And having sat in hundreds of those meetings, the call is not just that we need a God greater than the gods we've worshiped. We need a God greater than ourselves to save us, but we need other people for change to be real, to be sustained. And I know as a therapist, my heart is always for my clients, I want you to take the risks that you're taking in here with someone else,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not always going to go well. But it's that risk of vulnerability that is essential for connection. And without that sense of belonging, we most certainly will fall back into the isolation, the addiction, the fear, the shame that we've been talking about. So, connecting to God's stories, but then connecting to other people's stories, believing what you just said, which I don't think, I think we sometimes believe it in our heads, but not in our hearts, that we really, no matter what our stories are, we all suffer from the same condition. And we all, like your son, long for someone to see our dignity despite all those mess ups. There's something about an unguarded mind that accepts the gift of belonging sometimes.
And the so often the tension in the Christian world is depravity and dignity, and we don't want to go soft on sin, and we don't want to not face our depravity. But I've found over the years that most people do not have a hard time believing in their depravity. There might be a few people out there who don't see the mistakes they make, that don't see the problems that they've created in the way they relate. But for the most part, I've not had. I used to believe that the good counselor was this really prophetic person that would kind of come in and just say,
Have
you
a
hate your
zinger.
mother. You've always hated your mother. You better get better right now. Now stop it, stop it, stop it. And I used to think, well, that's the good counselor. They're the prophet because they're helping people see their depravity. But what I've found over the years is that most people are carrying so much shame, so much regret, that they know that they have fallen short. Um, and and they have a harder time believing in their dignity as an image bearer of God, not based on themselves, than they have believing in their depravity. Um,
Yes.
and so that's why it's just been interesting to watch, to watch him come alive when he tastes dignity, because
And
that's in all of us. We're
it
just
is.
better at hiding it.
I love
We're,
what Vicky
we're
said here on the feed. She says, the good outcomes that take my breath away are the expressions of gratitude clients have after experiencing love, which really is the message of my book. If we could just return to the simple practices, and they are practices of loving God and loving others. I think maybe it would take our breath away more than make us shudder at what's going on in this world. Um,
yeah,
Paul,
there's something about connecting, passion, um, beauty, that real connecting comes through. In the Chronicles of Narnia, the book, the horse and the boy. There's a moment where the horse, and sorry for the reference if you don't get it, but there's a moment where the horse meets Aslan and says, and is afraid she's going to be eaten, and she says, "You are so powerful and so beautiful," and that she walks toward him trembling. What a picture of
mm,
what God invites us to do. She walks this horse, and just it's a children's story, but this horse walks toward the Jesus figure, trembling and afraid that she might be eaten. But then she says, "You are so beautiful and so powerful that I'd rather be eaten by you than fed by anyone else."
wow.
And this
Oh,
incredible moment where you go, "Oh my goodness, that's what it means to connect and to believe and to belong."
can
Um,
you imagine being in a community where, yes, we go toward each other with fear and trembling, but we feel like it's worth being eaten alive for those morsels of nourishment, of spotting that dignity, of offering kindness, of expressing grace. One of the favorite stories in my book actually comes from a high school student, and it's in the last chapter of my book. Um, she has allowed me to use her name, so I'll just say her name is Danielle. And Danielle was not one of the popular kids in her high school. Her high school resume would fall pretty short. I mean, she didn't even have Snapchat. And high school was kind of hell for her. She was known as a goody two shoes and the teacher's pet.
Sharon, I
And
don't mean to interrupt you. I just want to say I don't have Snapchat either, but go ahead.
well, we didn't expect you to, but she came in one day, and I mean, her face was beaming. I thought maybe her parents let her leave school early, but actually she said before Christmas break she had written several kids in her high school a letter. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this is just going to put a bigger target on your back. Maybe your story should be less and not more. And she said, I wrote to one girl who had come out as gay, and everyone was teasing her, and her parents kicked her out. And so I told her that I thought she had courage, especially to tell me, because she knows I don't really agree with her. But I wanted her to know that God loves her and that I love her. And my parents said she could come stay with us if she wants to. And And then Danielle pulled this piece of paper out of her purse, and it was white notebook paper, and I could see splotches on it. I could tell that it had been bought at a great cost. And it was a return letter from this girl with exclamation marks that teenagers use all throughout. And she said, "Dear Danielle, no one has ever written me a letter." She said, "Thank you so much. I don't think God hates me because of you. And I might not come stay at your house, but I would really love to sit at your table at lunch." And as Danielle told the story, the tears just streamed down my face as I thought about who Jesus would say is the greatest in the kingdom. When he said, "You must become like children." And certainly offer your table to, as my teenage clients call it, the unfortunate ones at school. But really, in the church, we're all the oddballs and the outcasts and the fools, and as my children say, the totally uncool, who have been invited into God's kingdom, not because we're worthy, but because he knows we're hungry. And if we could see that in those around us, maybe we could overcome the fear and trembling for the nourishment that could be received in a communion of stories.
It's Sharon. I remember reading that story, and in the last chapter, you get very personal about some other stories as well. It it is amazing to me how much the church, and I'm not throwing, because the truth is how much I have spent so much of my life trying to be at the cool kid table, and I want to be at the cool kid table. I want to be I want to be the and this may come as a great surprise to you, Sharon, but I'm not that cool. And
Oh,
and
many things you are.
yet I've spent most of my life saying, what does it take to get to that table? And and as I've gotten older, and I even was involved in kind of some evangelism sort of stuff early on in my Christian life, where basically said, hey, we need to win with the winners, go with the goers, do with the doers,
Oh,
and so it was like, let's get the captain of the football team to know Jesus, and then everybody will know Jesus, and there's a place for that. I don't, um, but it seems like Jesus is speaking about the least of these and inviting us to, instead of being worried about which table we sit at, to be concerned about where other people are sitting.
yeah.
And instead of me going, what do I need to do to get to the cool kid table? And then there'll be a Christian at the cool kid table. I wonder what it'd be like to kind of say, God, forgive me for making the cool kid table my idol. And what would it be like to take my table and let the least of these come? The the people that were wishing they could just sit at a table. And I think that's where you find um, I think that's where you find Jesus and the idea of the incarnation, and that he comes and walks on our dirt dusty roads and lives among us, and he's in an oppressed people group in the middle of nowhere, never gets more than a couple hundred miles from his home, and there's very little cool about him in one sense.
And he goes to the people that are, as my high school clients say, the unfortunate ones,
Yeah, he
because
goes to the lepers,
we're the unfortunate ones.
and
I think
and,
it
and I
was
think
St.
when
Francis of Assisi who said that until you see the leper within, you will not be able to move toward the leper without. And so you just summarize kind of my whole book, which is really knowing, and you did it so well. And just as an aside, many people are saying that they think you lead the cool kids, and that you,
well, clearly they're not very cool if they think I'm in the cool kid club.
well,
But I'm just
I'll let
saying.
them, I'll let them communicate with you directly about that accusation. But it really is when we have been to the cross, and when I know that it is my DUI, my harsh words to my children, my judgment of the woman standing outside of Starbucks, smelling like beer and asking for money, that nailed him to that tree. And yet he offers me welcome and worthiness. Not because of who I am, but because of who he is. How can I withhold that from anyone?
It does create in us, if we're honest, if we see it the way that I think that if we see it biblically, and I hope I can see it, maybe I hope I'm seeing it correctly, that that we well, let me just say it this way. None of us, but there's a humility that will come with knowing God's graciousness to us that allows us to be involved with others. That, if there's anything I've learned over the years with my autistic son, is that we're all kind of spiritually autistic. At the end of the day, he doesn't get things very well. He misses the point. He sometimes gets obsessed with the wrong things. Well, those are some of the traits of autism. Well, I do the same thing spiritually. I get focused on the wrong things, and I miss the important things, and I am socially awkward, and all of a sudden I find myself spiritually in the same category that he is in mentally, and I'm spiritually autistic. And there's a way, and I've said it before, but I think we're all riding the short bus to glory, and there is a way in which on that short bus, the invitation from God is that we would realize who God is, realize who we are, and realize that He calls us His beloved in spite of who we are, so that we can treat others with the kind of dignity that comes with being an image bearer of God. And that is so different from the protecting and self-isolation and the negativity, if you will, that's so prevalent.
It reminds me, Jim, of a story I write in the book of an encounter I had with Jesus, when in my spirit I knew he was looking at me, not like the relapsing alcoholic, failure, divorced, sometimes lonely, empty woman that I think I am. And just one look from him was enough to undo all that. But that's just who you think you are. You're really the bride of Christ, loved before the foundation of the world, who Jesus would go to the depths of hell to hang on a cross for. And it's those moments in therapy that I live for. Now, that may seem too simple to some, but to be able to look at a client, whether they think that they've been obsessing about things, which we all do these days, or angry at God, or not believing in God, or enmeshed in some sort of sin or secret, and to be able to look at them in the way Jesus looked at me, that's just who you think you are, which will make you live that small story you talk about, Jim. But I want you to know who I see you as. And if we really interiorize that, all of the superfluous things that we get so attached to, whether it's achieving or performing or protesting, which sometimes is necessary, but it's a secondary thing. All of those things do fade, and allow us a sense that we belong. We belong to one another because we all need God way more than we think we do. And He loves us way more than we think He does. And if somehow we can communicate that with a welcome and a kindness and a sense of believing in the worth God writes into every story, I think change happens.
I think so too. And if I think we truly begin to understand this invitation of our God to connect with Him and each other, I think whether the people on the far left are correct or the people on the far right are correct, and they're probably neither correct. At the end of the day, if it all blows up, what is left is our relationship with Him and our relationship with the others that He has put in our lives. Those are the pieces that future and life and hope is built from. Not and so this idea of belonging is so crucial today, because I think the desire to belong is a godly desire. Remember, evil always hijacks good,
Mm.
and how evil has hijacked belonging is it's made me say, like we said at the very beginning, I've got to belong to this
Right.
group, and I can't be rejected by them. I'll be fake or I'll pretend, and God says, oh no, chosen you, you belong to me, my beloved. So
Jim, as we end tonight, I am just looking at the people that are online, and most therapists or therapists to be, what's one word of encouragement that you would give to them as we end tonight?
I am an old guy, and I've been doing this a long time, and there's days I doubt it, and there's days I wonder if I could have picked a better choice. But there is something about sitting with someone in their sorrow, in their secrets, that is so sacred
Mm.
and so beautiful and so life-giving that sometimes I wonder why I so often find myself humbled by the process as I think about, why would God trust me so in the lives of these people? Why would God trust me to listen well and engage with this story? Why is God, a sovereign God, brought this person into my office this day? And when I get a whiff in the air of that level of sacredness, and that I've been invited to be a part of that, and the possibility of connecting and healing and just watching the Spirit work, that is sacred business. I mean, that's take your shoes off, you're on holy ground business. And so there's a much better way to make a living than doing this. And for the people that are on here, I think this was advertised for counselors and potential counselors and counselors in training and all that stuff. And you will have days where you'll just say, I'm not sure what to do. But people aren't a treatment plan. People aren't a diagnosis. Of course, you'll have to give a diagnosis from time to time, and of course, you have to write a treatment plan from time to time. But don't reduce people to that. An image bearer of God, to talk and engage in their lives, is a sacred task that few get a chance to do. And if you do, you've got a special gift.
And I think the final thing that I would like to say is, don't forget as a therapist that you yourself are an image bearer, and that God will use every person, every conversation inside and outside of your office, as a means, as a way to connection with Him. If our heart is open even a little bit to that. And in these days, that's not easily done. And so may I gently suggest that if your heart feels closed to that, that you ask God to open it, because that's his business. And I agree with you, being a therapist and sitting with people is the most humbling, honorable work that I've done. But I know this, I've been impacted more by my clients than any client has been impacted by me. And that God would use these conversations to remind me of my worth in him does stir a passion in my heart to want to welcome others. And that's my prayer for the world today. May we, as therapists in our office where nobody sees and we can't talk about it with anyone, maybe start a little revolution that could begin to turn this world right side up. Jim, thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's been really great talking to you.
Well, it's been good to talk with you, Sharon. You're a good friend and someone I've always respected. So best of luck with you on this book. I hope you
Thank you.
sell a guabillion copies. But and I hope that works.
Well, I do too, but just getting to have a conversation like this almost makes the work of writing the book worthwhile.
Well, it has been fun. It has been fun to connect.
So I hope you have a good night, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Good night.